There's a particular kind of confidence that only existed in Britain during the 1970s. It wasn't loud. It wasn't boastful. It was the quiet, absolute certainty of a family standing in a showroom, pointing at something strange and saying, yes, that one, that's the future. Tonight, we're stepping back into those homes, the ones with the patterned carpets and the heavy curtains drawn against the cold, the ones where every single object on display had been chosen with pride, with savings carefully set aside, with the unmistakable belief that this purchase was going to make life better. And in some ways it did. Britain in the 1970s was coming out of decades of rationing, austerity, and quiet sacrifice. People who had grown up with coal fires and tin baths were suddenly being offered color, convenience, and comfort on credit terms they could actually afford. So when something new arrived in the shops, families didn't hesitate. They bought it. They installed it. They showed it off to the neighbors. Right. Let's start with the bathroom. Because if there's one color that defines the entire decade, one single choice that an entire nation made almost in unison, it's the color you're about to remember whether you want to or not. Avocado green. Say it out loud and watch how fast the memory comes back. Not just a color, but an entire bathroom. The bath, the sink, the toilet, all matching, all soaked in that same deep, slightly murky green that somehow felt warm and earthy at the time. This wasn't a fringe trend. Walk into magazine archives from the early 1970s, and you'll see it everywhere, page after page, presented as the height of modern taste. Designers paired it with bold geometric tiles, with thick carpet laid directly onto the bathroom floor, with bright orange or pink accessories that somehow didn't clash, at least not to anyone living through it. Avocado wasn't just accepted. It was aspirational. If you had it, you'd arrived. Look up. Right now, in your own home, just look up at the ceiling. If you live in an older British property, there's a real chance you'll see it. A swirled pattern. A series of stippled little peaks, almost like a frozen sea. That texture has a name, and that name became so common it turned into a household word all on its own: Artex. In the 1970s, Artex wasn't just popular, it was practically unavoidable. The appeal was simple and completely understandable. Plastering a ceiling properly took years of skill. Artex didn't. You could buy it, apply it yourself with nothing more than a brush or a sponge, and instantly hide every crack, every uneven patch, every flaw in the surface above you. For a generation of homeowners doing their own decorating for the first time, it felt like a small miracle. No skill required, professional-looking results guaranteed. Here's what nobody in that room was told. Up until 1984, the standard Artex formula contained white asbestos, mixed in to strengthen the material and make it more fire-resistant. Nobody was hiding this maliciously. It simply wasn't treated as dangerous information at the time. Asbestos was already a known hazard in heavy industry, in shipyards, in factories, but in a tin of ceiling texture sitting in a family's spare room. It barely registered as a concern. While it stays undisturbed, sealed under paint, Artex is generally considered low risk. The real danger only appears the moment it's sanded, drilled, or scraped. The moment those microscopic fibers are released into the air of the very room a family is standing in. And those fibers are roughly 1,200 times thinner than a human hair. You cannot see them. You cannot smell them. You simply breathe them in without ever knowing it happened. This is precisely why I want you in the comments after this video. Tell me, did your childhood home have Artex ceilings? Because if you're watching this in Britain, the odds say yes, you absolutely did. And if this kind of forgotten history is exactly what you come here for, this is your moment. Subscribe now, because what's coming next in this list is just as overlooked and just as unexpected. Now drop your eyes back down to the floor, because we're stepping straight onto another 70s obsession. Thick, deep, almost impossibly soft underfoot, the shag carpet. If avocado was the color of the decade, shag pile was its texture. Long, loose fibers stretching upward in every direction, available in oranges, deep browns, and yes, that same persistent avocado green. Manufacturers were experimenting wildly during this period, layering different shades together, creating sculpted patterns you could actually feel beneath your bare feet. And people loved that feeling. It wasn't just flooring anymore. It was an experience. There was a practical justification too, or at least families told themselves there was. A patterned, multicolored shag carpet was remarkably good at hiding dirt. Spill something, drop crumbs, track in mud from the garden, and somehow it simply melted into the chaos of color and texture already there. For households without the modern cleaning equipment we take for granted now, that forgiveness felt like a genuine advantage. But here's the contrast nobody mentioned in the showroom. That same deep tangled pile that hid dirt so effectively was also remarkably good at holding onto it. Dust, hair, crumbs, pet fur, all of it sank down into those long fibers and stayed there, far below where a normal vacuum cleaner of the era could ever reach. Allergy sufferers in 70s households were, quite unknowingly, living directly on top of one of the most effective dust traps ever installed in a British home. And then there's the static. Anyone who lived through this remembers it. Walk across a shag carpet in socks during a dry winter evening, then touch a light switch or another person, and you'd get an actual visible spark. Funny in hindsight. Genuinely startling at the time, especially for children who hadn't yet learned to expect it. By the early 80s, the shag carpet had quietly become a symbol of everything people wanted to leave behind. Replaced, ripped out, rolled up and thrown away, almost as quickly as it had been installed a decade earlier. But carpets and ceilings are still just the backdrop. What happens at the center of the room, around the dinner table, is where things get genuinely strange. If there was one piece of equipment that defined the British dinner party in the early 1970s, it wasn't the food itself. It was the fondue set sitting proudly in the middle of the table. A small pot, usually ceramic or enameled metal, suspended over a tiny open flame fueled by methylated spirit, or a candle burner underneath. Guests would gather around it, spearing chunks of bread or meat onto long forks, dipping them into melted cheese or warm chocolate, laughing together as the night went on. For a country that had spent so long eating quietly, formally, separately, this was something genuinely new. It wasn't just dinner. It was theater. It was togetherness, built right into the furniture of the evening. Department stores sold fondue sets as the essential wedding gift of the decade. If you were getting married in 1972, there was a very strong chance a fondue set was sitting somewhere on your gift list, wrapped and waiting. Practically guaranteed. But look closer at what was actually happening around that table. Every guest was dipping into the exact same pot, using the exact same melted cheese or chocolate, with forks that had just been in their mouths moments before. Nobody thought twice about it at the time. Hygiene standards and conversations around shared food simply hadn't caught up to what was becoming common practice in British dining rooms. And then there was the flame itself, an open, uncovered source of heat sitting at child height on a dinner table, often surrounded by excitable guests and a fair amount of wine. The decline, when it came fast. By the middle of the decade, fondue sets were already being pushed to the back of cupboards, eventually destined for the loft or the local charity shop. The preparation took too long, the cleanup took too long, and quietly, slowly, people started to feel a little uneasy about exactly how communal that pot really was. It's a strange thing, watching something go from essential to obsolete in barely half a decade. But fondue sets weren't alone in that fate. Sitting right alongside them in the kitchen drawer was something arguably even stranger. Christmas dinner, 1973. The turkey arrives at the table, and instead of a carving knife held steady by hand, there's a quiet electric hum. Two serrated blades vibrating rapidly against each other, slicing through meat with almost no effort at all. The electric carving knife had arrived, and for a brief shining moment, it was the single most impressive thing on the table. Think about what this actually represented to families at the time. For generations, carving the Sunday roast had been a skill, often passed from father to son, something you practiced and got better at over years. Suddenly, a machine could do it instantly, cleanly, with results that looked genuinely professional, even if you'd never carved a thing in your life. It wasn't really about saving time. It was about pride. Pulling out an electric carving knife in front of visiting family meant something. It said this household had kept pace with modern living. The home peanut butter machine sounds like something invented as a joke. It wasn't. It was a genuine mass-produced kitchen appliance, sold across Britain and America throughout the 1970s, and families bought it in real numbers. The concept traced back further than most people realize, originally adapted from a simple meat grinder design decades earlier. By the 70s, electric versions had reached the consumer market properly, some featuring an adjustable dial that let you choose the exact texture you wanted, smooth on one end, deliberately chunky on the other. You'd pour in a handful of nuts at the top, flick a switch, and watch fresh peanut butter emerge from the spout below, still warm, still glistening. For a household trying to project a certain image, that machine sitting on the counter said something specific. It said this family didn't simply buy peanut butter from a jar like everyone else. They made it, from scratch, at home. Never mind that the jar version sitting in the supermarket cost a fraction of the price, and took absolutely no effort whatsoever. This is really the heart of what's been driving this entire video. Britain in the 1970s wasn't just buying appliances, it was buying belief. Belief that doing something the modern mechanical way was inherently better than doing it the old way, even when the actual result was nearly identical. Even when the cost and effort barely made sense when you stopped to add it up. The peanut butter machine eventually vanished from kitchens almost as quickly as it had arrived, pushed aside by the simple reality that grinding your own nuts at home, however novel, wasn't actually solving a problem anyone urgently had. Picture walking into a 1970s living room and finding, right at its center, a sunken section of floor. Not a step down by accident, but by design. A deliberately recessed seating area, several steps lower than the rest of the room, lined with built-in cushioned benches arranged in a circle. This was the conversation pit, and for a certain kind of forward-thinking household, it represented the absolute peak of modern living. The idea behind it was genuinely thoughtful. By lowering the seating area, designers created a distinct, intimate zone within an otherwise open-plan space, encouraging people to actually face each other and talk, rather than scattering around a room arranged to face a television. It photographed beautifully in the design magazines of the era. Families would gather down in that pit with drinks and cushions, feeling like they were part of something genuinely new, something American and glamorous that had finally made its way into British homes. But step back and consider what a sunken floor actually means in a family home with children, with elderly relatives visiting, with guests who'd had a glass or two of wine and weren't paying close attention to where the floor suddenly dropped away. There was no railing in most designs, no clear visual marker at night, just a sudden, unmarked step down in low lighting, right in the middle of a busy social gathering. The number of minor injuries this design quietly caused across British homes never made the magazine spreads. And then there was the practical nightmare of changing your mind. Unlike a sofa you could simply replace, a conversation pit was built into the structural floor of the house. Removing one meant construction, real building work, real expense. Plenty of homeowners who installed them in the early 70s were still living with that sunken floor well into the following decade, long after the trend had completely faded, simply because tearing it out cost more than most families could justify. This is the thread running through every single item on tonight's list so far. The telephone itself had barely changed shape for decades in Britain. Heavy, black, solid, the kind of object that simply sat in the hallway and rang when it needed to. Then, in the late 1960s, the General Post Office introduced something genuinely different, something designed specifically to feel modern, stylish, almost futuristic by comparison. They called it the trim phone. It was lighter than anything before it. Sleek, narrow, available in fashionable two-tone colors like gray green and gray blue. Instead of the traditional bell, it rang with an electronic warbling tone that nobody in Britain had ever heard from a telephone before. And the dial itself glowed softly in the dark. A small luminous halo around the numbers, letting you find the phone in a darkened hallway without fumbling for a light switch. By the start of the 1980s, well over 1.5 million trim phones were in active use across British homes. It became the telephone of choice for anyone who wanted their hallway to feel just a little bit more like the future. Here's the detail almost nobody talks about now. That soft glow on the dial wasn't powered by a battery or a tiny bulb. It came from tritium, a radioactive gas sealed inside a small glass tube behind the dial. The radiation it gave off was genuinely tiny, roughly comparable to wearing a watch with a luminous face. But as public understanding and concern around radioactivity grew through the decade, the GPO quietly began phasing the glowing dial out altogether. The story doesn't end with the phones in people's homes. Years later, in 1991, the United Kingdom Atomic Energy Authority was actually fined £3,000 by a magistrate's court after thousands of discarded trim phone dials were found accumulating, completely unmanaged in a waste skip. A telephone that once sat proudly glowing on a hallway table had quietly become, decades later, a genuine piece of radioactive waste that nobody had thought carefully about disposing of. It's a strange thought, isn't it? That the most stylish phone in the house was also faintly radioactive the entire time, and nobody so much as blinked. There's one more item left on tonight's list, and it might be the strangest of them all. Because this one wasn't sitting quietly in a corner. It was sitting in the middle of the bedroom, full of water, waiting to either soothe you to sleep or soak your entire carpet. The waterbed arrived in Britain carrying an unmistakable air of glamour. Originally developed in California in the late 1960s, it crossed the Atlantic throughout the 70s, wrapped in everything fashionable and forward-thinking the decade had to offer. This wasn't just a mattress. It was a lifestyle statement, sold with the promise of perfectly even support, no pressure points, and a faintly luxurious, almost rebellious feeling that traditional firm mattresses simply couldn't match. And there was genuine substance behind the appeal. Water naturally contours to the shape of whoever's lying on it, distributing weight evenly in a way standard spring mattresses of the era, deliberately built firm on doctors' advice, never could. For couples wanting something that felt distinctly modern, distinctly different from their parents' bedroom, a waterbed practically announced that this household had embraced the future. But underneath that smooth, glamorous surface sat an entirely different reality. A filled waterbed could weigh well over half a ton, an astonishing amount of weight resting directly on a bedroom floor never designed to bear it. Filling one meant running a hose from the bathroom tap, often for hours, while praying nothing went wrong along the way. And moving one, if a family ever changed address, meant draining hundreds of gallons of water back out again, before the heavy wooden frame could even be lifted. Then there was the quieter, more persistent worry. A single small puncture in the vinyl liner, something as simple as a stray pin or an overly enthusiastic pet, could mean a slow, hidden leak seeping directly into the floorboards beneath the bed, often for days before anyone noticed the carpet had turned damp. By the early 1980s, plenty of British families who'd proudly installed a waterbed were quietly draining it for the final time, swapping the romance of sleeping on water for the much simpler reliability of a regular mattress. 9 objects, 9 genuine symbols of a country trying, in every way it knew how, to feel modern after decades of making do. And that hunger for modernity is exactly what connects every single item we've covered tonight. So here's the pattern, laid bare. Every single item on this list, the avocado bathroom, the Artex ceiling, the shag carpet, the fondue set, the electric carving knife, the peanut butter machine, the conversation pit, the glowing trim phone, the waterbed, they all came from the exact same place emotionally. Not from need, from hunger. Think about what the generation buying these things had actually lived through. Many of these same households had grown up during rationing, had grown up watching their parents make do, repair, repurpose, and wait. Color itself had been scarce, not just in fabric and paint, but in life. Grey winters, grey clothes, grey conversations about money that never seemed to stretch far enough. And then suddenly, in the space of 1 decade, color, texture, and convenience became affordable, available, sitting right there in the shop window, waiting to be taken home. Nobody buying an avocado bathroom suite in 1971 was thinking about resale value a decade later. Nobody applying Artex to their ceiling with a kitchen sponge was thinking about airborne fibers 20 years down the line. Nobody filling a waterbed for the first time was thinking about the carpet underneath it. They were thinking about right now, About finally having something that felt modern, something that said their family had moved forward, something their own parents never could have afforded or even imagined. That hunger is precisely what made an entire nation move in such strange unison. It's why millions of homes ended up with the same color bathroom, the same swirled ceiling, the same deep carpet, the same glowing little telephone in the hallway, almost as if the whole country had agreed on it together without ever actually discussing it. And here's the part one want you to sit with for a second. The Artex ceiling isn't some distant historical curiosity confined to old photographs. If your home in Britain was decorated any time before the late 1990s, there is a real, genuine chance that same swirled pattern is sitting directly above your head right now, completely undisturbed, completely fine, as long as nobody ever drills into it without knowing what's actually there. That's not meant to frighten you. It's meant to make you look up just once tonight, and actually wonder about the house you're sitting in. There's no shame in any of this. None at all. The families who filled their homes with these objects weren't foolish. They weren't careless. They were doing exactly what every generation does, reaching for whatever version of progress was available to them at the time, trusting the people selling it, trusting that modern automatically meant better. That's the real lesson buried underneath all the avocado green and swirled ceilings. Progress always arrives wearing its best clothes. It always looks finished, tested, safe. It's only years later, sometimes decades later, that the full picture gets filled in, and we get to see what was actually true the whole time. The glowing trim phone dial looked magical in 1973. By 1991, that same glow had become a fine the government had to pay for mishandling radioactive waste. Nobody saw that coming from a hallway table. So the next time you're sitting in your parents' house, or your grandparents' house, or even your own, take a proper look around, at the ceiling, at the floor, at whatever strange gadget is still sitting at the back of a kitchen cupboard, half forgotten, because every single of those objects was once somebody's proof that things were finally getting better. And in its own way, it was right. Britain genuinely was moving forward. It just didn't always know the full cost of how it got there. If this video took you back to a room you'd genuinely forgotten existed, that's exactly what we're here for. Tell me down in the comments which one of these 9 hit closest to home. Was it the avocado bathroom your family fought about replacing for 30 years? Was it the Artex ceiling you only just found out about tonight? Was it that glowing little phone sitting by your front door? Whatever it was, I want to hear it. And if you enjoyed traveling back through this decade with me, do 3 things before you go. Hit like on this video. It genuinely helps this channel keep telling these stories. Subscribe if you haven't already, because there's plenty more of this coming. And if you know someone who'd remember every single one of these, send this their way. Let's see how many of them they actually had. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.